Have you ever wondered what it would look like to take one of the world's richest economies and just completely rewire it to serve another? Well, that's pretty much exactly what happened in India under British rule. And we're not talking about just a few policy tweaks here. This was a ground-up, fundamental re-engineering of an entire subcontinent's economy, its society, and its whole place in the world. So let's dive right in. Okay, to get a sense of just how massive this change was, get a load of this. In 1750, before the British really took firm control, India was an absolute global manufacturing powerhouse. It accounted for nearly a quarter of the entire world's industrial output. A quarter! Fast forward just 150 years to 1900, and that number? It had crashed to a tiny 2%. So how on earth does a global economic leader fall that far that fast? Well, the story really begins with the land itself. So the very first target in this grand re-engineering project was the countryside. For the British, the goal was brutally simple: turn the land into a predictable, reliable cash machine. And to pull that off, they had to tear down the centuries-old systems of land ownership and build something totally new in its place. To do this, they rolled out three major systems. You had the permanent settlement, the Ryotwari, and the Mahalwari. Now, they all differed on the little details, like who exactly was cutting the check to the government, but the underlying goal, it was identical for all three: create a steady, predictable river of cash flowing straight to the colonial government. This super rigid cash-first approach was just a world away from the more flexible, community-based systems that had been in place before. And the human cost of all this was just devastating. We're talking about millions of people losing the traditional rights to land their families had farmed for generations. Overnight, they were turned into vulnerable tenants. And those rigid tax demands, they forced farmers into the clutches of predatory moneylenders, creating this horrible, vicious cycle of debt. And this is the part you really have to get. The British didn't just extract wealth, they completely shattered the social fabric of rural India. All right, so once the countryside was reorganized to just pump out revenue, the next target was India's world-famous industries. The new goal was to pivot India away from being a manufacturing competitor to Britain and turn it into a raw material supplier for Britain's own factories. It was all about turning the workshop of the world into a farm for the empire. And you have to understand, this shift wasn't an accident. It was driven by very deliberate policy. Colonial officials systematically took apart India's thriving artisan sectors, especially textiles. They would slap these crazy high import duties on Indian goods trying to get into Britain, but at the same time, they let British manufactured goods flood Indian markets with almost no taxes at all. So yeah, the workshop of the world was being intentionally remade into a farm for the British Empire. And what this created was a new, totally dependent trade loop. It worked like this. India would export cheap raw materials like cotton to fuel all those British factories. Those factories would then spin that cotton into finished textiles, which were then shipped right back and sold to the now captive Indian market, often at high prices. This closed loop just effectively choked out any local industry and locked India into this subordinate economic role. Now, you can't just upend an entire economy like that and not expect massive social consequences. An economic shock of this magnitude doesn't happen in a vacuum. The widespread distress in both the countryside and the cities, it triggered a profound social and cultural crisis. But it also sparked a powerful awakening. Just let this number sink in for a second. 10 million. That's the estimated death toll from just one event, the Great Bengal Famine of 1770. And it wasn't some isolated tragedy. Over the course of British rule, there were something like 30 major famines. Colonial policies were pushing farmers to grow cash crops like indigo instead of food. And when you combine that with a totally indifferent official response, you turn droughts into horrific man-made catastrophes. So all of this immense suffering, from the famines, from the crushing debt, from watching traditional livelihoods just collapse, it forced a lot of Indians to start questioning everything. The old ways, the old answers, they just seemed to be failing. All of this turmoil created the perfect, fertile ground for a whole wave of new social and religious reform movements as people desperately searched for new answers to the crises they were facing. And a whole spectrum of new movements just exploded onto the scene. You had groups like Raja Ram Mohan Roy's Brahmo Samaj, which was pushing for things like modern education and women's rights. And then you had movements like Jyotiba Phule's Satya Shodhak Samaj, which launched this powerful attack on the caste system itself. As different as they all were, they shared one thing in common. They began to challenge old traditions and started to lay the intellectual groundwork for a modern Indian identity. So you have this social awakening happening on the ground. But at the same time, a powerful intellectual response was also taking shape. A new generation of Indian thinkers began to scientifically diagnose what exactly was happening to their country's economy. And this, right here, was the birth of economic nationalism. And at the forefront of this whole intellectual charge were thinkers like Dadabhai Naoroji. He went way beyond just blaming individual British officials. Instead, he put the entire colonial system under the microscope, and his conclusion was as simple as it was devastating. British rule, he argued, wasn't a partnership. It was, as he put it, a process of systematically draining India's wealth. This explosive idea became known as the drain of wealth theory. It argued that a huge chunk of India's national income was literally being siphoned off to Britain, year after year, with nothing of economic value coming back in return. This wasn't trade, it was an economic bleed. Indian revenues were paying for Britain's administration in India, for its military adventures, and even for the pensions of retired colonial officials back in London. But here's the twist in the story. Even with this massive economic drain happening, new forces were starting to emerge within India. You had Indian entrepreneurs, people like the Tatas, who began building modern industries, like the first major steel plant in 1907. A new Indian capitalist class and an organized working class started to take shape. These were the completely unintended byproducts of all those colonial economic changes. Which brings us to our final big question. The British absolutely succeeded in rewiring India's economy to serve their own imperial interests, and it led to deindustrialization and incredible poverty. But in doing so, by creating all of these new economic grievances, new social classes, and a new nationalist consciousness that could actually articulate those grievances, did they inadvertently forge the very tools and the very anger that would ultimately lead to the end of their own rule? That is a powerful legacy to think about.